The papers were already spread across the dining table when I walked in, neat and final, like a verdict that had been waiting for me. My father didn't look up right away. He kept his eyes on the documents, smoothing one corner with his thumb, a habit he had whenever he wanted control. My brother sat across from him, arms crossed, pretending not to watch my reaction. "Sit down," my father said, calm, almost bored. I didn't. I stared at the deed, my name missing where it had always been. My father finally looked up and said it plainly, like it was a small adjustment. He told me he'd taken the house out of my name and transferred it to my brother. No discussion, no warning, just done. I felt heat rush to my face. That house was in my name for a reason. I'd signed for it. I'd paid for it. I'd carried it when everyone else walked away. My brother shifted in his seat and said I shouldn't take it personally. He said I was doing fine, and he needed it more. I asked my father how he managed the transfer without me. He said he handled it. That was all. I realized then this wasn't about property. It was about power. And I'd just been stripped of it in my own family home. My father explained his decision like he was settling an argument he'd already won. He said my brother had a family to think about. He said I was independent, capable, resilient. Words that always meant I'd be expected to absorb the damage quietly. My brother nodded along, avoiding my eyes, already settling into his new role. I reminded them that the mortgage wasn't paid with good intentions. It was paid with money. My money. Every month, on time, without fail. My father waved it off and said things would be worked out. That phrase made my stomach turn. It always meant I'd be expected to carry the weight again. I asked why I hadn't been consulted. My father said he didn't think I'd object. That hurt more than the transfer itself. It meant my feelings, my consent, didn't matter enough to check. When I finally left, no one stopped me. The door closed behind me with a soft click that felt louder than any argument. Sitting in my car, I scrolled through old bank alerts, years of payments tied to that address. Proof I hadn't imagined my role in keeping that house afloat. As I started the engine, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was spam. I answered anyway. That decision changed everything. The voice on the line was professional and calm, the kind that carried authority without raising volume. She introduced herself as a mortgage officer from the lending company tied to the house. Hearing the address spoken out loud made my chest tighten. She asked me a question that didn't make sense at first. She wanted to know why I hadn't been notified about a recent title transfer. I told her I'd just found out myself. There was a pause on the line, longer than comfortable. She explained that while the deed had changed, the mortgage had not. According to their records, I was still the primary borrower, legally responsible for the loan. I pulled over, heart pounding, trying to process the contradiction. House gone. Debt still mine. She asked if I had authorized the transfer. I told her no, and my voice cracked despite my effort to stay steady. She thanked me and said the bank needed to review the situation immediately. When the call ended, I sat there staring at the steering wheel, a strange mix of anger and relief flooding in. My father had moved fast, but not carefully. He'd assumed I'd clean up after him like always. For the first time since leaving the house, I felt something shift. I wasn't powerless. I was still tied to that property, in a way none of them had anticipated. And the bank was paying attention now. The next morning, I walked into the bank branch with a knot in my stomach and a folder of printed statements under my arm. The mortgage officer greeted me with a polite smile that didn't quite hide her concern. She led me into a small office and pulled up the account on her screen. She showed me everything. The original loan application with my signature, years of payment history, all from my account, insurance documents, tax records, correspondence addressed to me. Then she pointed to the title transfer paperwork. My consent was missing. She explained that the bank never approved a change in ownership without the borrower's authorization. That meant they were exposed, and they didn't like exposure. I listened carefully, realizing the situation wasn't just unfair, it was unstable. She said the bank had two priorities, protecting their loan and correcting the inconsistency. Until that happened, nothing about the house was settled. My father's decision wasn't final, it was sloppy. Before I left, she warned me not to agree to anything without legal advice. She said families often complicated matters like this by assuming the bank would stay out of it. They were wrong. As I stepped back outside, my phone buzzed with messages from my brother, cheerful updates about his house. I didn't respond. I was beginning to understand my position more clearly. That evening, my father called me for the first time since the transfer. His tone was softer, cautious, like someone approaching thin ice. He said the bank had contacted him with questions. He said there must have been a misunderstanding and asked me to help clear it up. I asked him one simple question: why the mortgage officer called me first instead of him or my brother. He didn't answer right away. When he did, he told me not to complicate things. That was when I realized the pattern I'd lived with for years. I was reliable, so I was used. I was quiet, so decisions were made around me. My father hadn't expected resistance, just compliance. I told him I wasn't signing anything or making calls on his behalf. He accused me of being difficult, of creating tension in the family. I told him tension already existed, it just wasn't visible when I carried it alone. After the call, I sat in my apartment, rereading the bank emails and reviewing my records. Every detail lined up. The timeline was clean. There were no gaps I couldn't explain. For the first time, I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was preparing. Whatever happened next wouldn't be accidental or quiet. They had moved without me. Now everything had stopped, waiting on my decision. The next few days felt unnaturally quiet, the kind of calm that only exists before something breaks. I gathered every document related to the house and spread them across my coffee table. Mortgage statements, tax notices, insurance confirmations, emails from the bank. I wasn't guessing anymore, I was building a record. I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. The down payment. It hadn't come from my father. It hadn't come from my brother. It had come entirely from me. Transferred from my savings account the same week the loan was approved. At the time, no one questioned it. They were just relieved someone had stepped up. I called the mortgage officer back and asked what the bank planned to do next. She explained that compliance would likely demand a formal review. Until that process ended, no refinancing, no sale, no clean ownership transfer could happen. The house was effectively frozen. That night, my brother showed up at my apartment unannounced. He said we should talk like adults. He said Dad was stressed. He said I was blowing things out of proportion. I asked him if he could qualify for the mortgage on his own. He didn't answer. He just stared at the floor, and in that silence, I finally understood how much leverage I had. The family group chat lit up the following morning. My brother posted photos of the house, talking about renovations he wanted to start right away. New floors, new appliances. He spoke like someone already settled, already entitled. My father chimed in with approving comments, acting as if everything were resolved. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the screenshots to the mortgage officer. She replied within minutes, telling me to save everything. Documentation mattered. Later that day, I received a formal email from the bank's compliance department. The language was polite but firm. They needed clarification regarding the ownership change and my continued liability on the loan. They scheduled a meeting and copied my father and brother on the message. That was when the tone shifted. My father called again, no longer calm. He asked why I'd involved the bank. I told him the bank had involved itself the moment my name stayed on the mortgage. He accused me of trying to embarrass him. I reminded him he hadn't asked my permission before making the transfer. Silence followed, heavy and charged. By evening, my brother sent a long message apologizing for how things looked, asking if we could reset. I didn't reply. I wasn't interested in resets anymore. I wanted clarity, and I was finally in a position to demand it. The compliance meeting took place over a video call 2 days later. I logged in early, my documents neatly arranged, my notes prepared. My father joined next, stiff and guarded. My brother followed, visibly uncomfortable, sitting too close to the camera like he wanted to control the frame. The compliance officer laid everything out clearly. The bank could not legally maintain a loan under my name, while the property was titled to someone else without my written consent. It exposed them to risk, and they intended to resolve it quickly. My father tried to explain it as a family matter. The officer corrected him, gently but firmly. This was a financial matter now. Family dynamics didn't override contracts. Two options were presented. Either the title would be restored to my name, or my brother would refinance the mortgage entirely under his own qualifications. There was no third option. I watched my brother's face as the numbers were discussed, his income, his credit history, the likelihood of approval. It became clear, without being said outright, that refinancing wasn't realistic. When the call ended, no one spoke for a moment. Then my father turned to me and said we'd talk privately. For the first time, his voice carried uncertainty. I realized something then. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone in that call felt it. That evening, my father came to my apartment alone. No announcements. No authority in his posture this time. He sat on the couch, looking older than I remembered, his confidence dulled by the reality he could no longer control. He told me he hadn't meant to hurt me. He said he assumed I'd understand, that I'd always been understanding. I asked him why understanding always meant sacrifice on my end. He didn't have an answer. He admitted he'd believed I would keep paying the mortgage quietly, even after the house was transferred. Hearing it spoken out loud hurt more than I expected. It wasn't an accident. It was an assumption built on years of my compliance. I told him I wasn't angry anymore. I was done being taken for granted. He asked what I wanted. The question felt heavy, but also overdue. I told him I wanted fairness, transparency, respect. I wanted the house returned to my name, or the debt removed from it completely. No more half measures. He nodded slowly, like someone recalculating everything he thought he knew. Before he left, he asked if there was any way to fix this without tearing the family apart. I told him the damage wasn't coming from the bank or from me. It came from decisions made without my consent. Fixing it meant accepting that. The next morning, the bank sent updated documents for review. I read every line carefully, no longer rushing through legal language like it was someone else's problem. The proposed correction would restore the title to my name, effective immediately, while keeping the mortgage unchanged, clean, simple, final. My brother called me after receiving the same email. His voice was tight, defensive. He said Dad felt blindsided. He said I'd gone too far. I asked him one question. If the roles were reversed, would he have stayed silent? He didn't answer. He just told me I was making things harder than they needed to be. I told him the hard part had already happened when the house was taken out of my name without asking. Everything after that was just consequence. By the end of the day, my father confirmed he would cooperate with the correction. No apology, but no resistance either. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement I'd ever received. As I signed the documents electronically, I felt something settle inside me. Not victory. Not revenge. Just clarity. This wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about reclaiming my agency. And I knew, as the confirmation email arrived, that this was only the beginning of a much larger reckoning. Once the title correction was submitted, the house entered a strange limbo. On paper, it was moving back to me, but emotionally, it felt like I'd stepped into open conflict with my own family. My father stopped calling. My brother stopped pretending everything was fine. Silence settled in, thick and uncomfortable. The bank confirmed the correction would take several business days to finalize. During that time, no one could touch the property. No renovations, no refinancing, no decisions without my approval. For the first time, control wasn't assumed, it was documented. I revisited the house one afternoon, standing across the street like a stranger. My brother's car was in the driveway. He hadn't moved out yet, not officially. I didn't confront him. I didn't need to. The process was already in motion. Later that night, I received an email from a real estate attorney recommended by the bank. She confirmed what I already suspected. My father had no legal authority to transfer ownership without my consent. The correction wasn't a favor, it was a requirement. Reading that grounded me. This wasn't emotional chaos anymore. It was a sequence of decisions, consequences, and corrections. Still, part of me wondered what would happen when the paperwork became reality. When the house was officially mine again, something would have to give. Families didn't like mirrors held up to their behavior, and I was done looking away. The confirmation came on a Thursday morning. The title had been officially restored to my name. The email was brief, factual, and final. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, letting it sink in. Nothing dramatic happened, no fireworks, just a quiet shift back into alignment. My father called an hour later. His voice was controlled, careful. He said the house situation was resolved as if the ordeal had simply passed on its own. I didn't correct him. I didn't need to. The resolution spoke for itself. He asked what I planned to do next. The question surprised me. It was the first time he'd asked instead of assumed. I told him I planned to move forward responsibly, the same way I always had. That afternoon, I sent my brother a formal notice. 6 months. That was the timeline. Plenty of time to find another place, plenty of time to adjust. I wasn't interested in sudden displacement, just boundaries. He replied with a single sentence, accusing me of choosing money over family. I didn't respond. I'd spent years choosing family over myself, and it hadn't protected me. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because everything was fixed, but because nothing was being hidden anymore. The truth was finally doing the heavy lifting for me. My brother showed up the next weekend, anger barely contained. He accused me of humiliating him, of forcing him into a corner. I listened quietly, letting him empty everything he'd been holding back. When he finished, I asked him why he thought the house had been his to begin with. He said Dad promised it to him. He said he believed that was enough. I told him promises didn't pay mortgages. Contracts did. Responsibility did. Silence stretched between us, thick with resentment and realization. He admitted he'd never looked at the paperwork. Never asked how the loan worked. He assumed I'd continue handling it, because I always had. Hearing that confirmed everything I'd already learned about my role in the family. I told him I wasn't taking the house away from him out of spite. I was taking it back because it was never truly his. That distinction mattered, even if it hurt. He left without saying goodbye. I watched from the window as he drove off, knowing this wasn't the end of the conflict, just a new phase. Later that evening, my father sent a message asking if we could talk soon. Not about the house, but about us. I didn't answer right away. I needed to decide what that conversation would even look like. For the first time, reconciliation wasn't automatic. It would have to be intentional, earned, and grounded in reality. When my father and I finally met, it wasn't at the house. We chose a neutral place, quiet and public. He seemed smaller somehow, less certain. He started by saying he never meant for things to spiral the way they had. I told him intentions didn't erase impact. He admitted he'd leaned on me because I was dependable. He said he didn't realize how much pressure that placed on me until it backfired. I asked him why it had to backfire for him to see it. That question stayed between us, unanswered. We talked about years of unspoken expectations, about how my brother was protected while I was tested, about how fairness had always been framed as need rather than contribution. It wasn't an argument, it was an inventory. I told him the house situation had forced me to stop absorbing imbalance quietly. I said I wasn't cutting anyone off, but I was done carrying weight without acknowledgement or authority. He asked what I needed going forward. I told him I needed honesty, boundaries, and respect for my autonomy. Not approval, not praise, just recognition that my consent mattered. When we parted, nothing felt resolved, but something felt different. The hierarchy had cracked. Whatever relationship followed would be built on clearer terms, or not at all. As the weeks passed, the tension slowly shifted into something more manageable. My brother began apartment hunting. Not enthusiastically, but realistically. The house grew quieter, less charged. It felt less like a battleground, and more like a place returning to neutral. I met again with the attorney to finalize everything. She confirmed there were no remaining issues tied to the title or mortgage. The house was clean, legally and financially. Hearing that gave me a sense of closure I hadn't expected. What lingered wasn't anger, but awareness. I saw my family differently now. Not as villains, but as people who had benefited from my silence without questioning it. That didn't make them evil. It made them human. It also meant change was necessary. My father began checking in, cautiously, asking instead of directing. It felt awkward, but real. My brother kept his distance, wounded pride still raw. I let him have space. Healing wasn't something I could manage for him. One evening, standing alone in the house, I realized how much had shifted internally. I wasn't bracing anymore. I wasn't waiting for the next demand. The house wasn't just mine again on paper. It represented something deeper. Proof that I could assert myself without becoming cruel. And that firmness didn't have to destroy connection. Once my brother secured an apartment, the reality of the situation finally settled into the family. Boxes appeared in the hallway. The house felt temporary in a way it never had before. I stayed out of the process unless asked. This wasn't about hovering or control. It was about letting consequences unfold naturally. My father stopped by one afternoon while my brother was packing. He didn't say much, just watched quietly. Later, he pulled me aside and said he hadn't expected things to change so permanently. I told him permanence was the point. Temporary discomfort was easier to ignore. That conversation lingered with me. I realized how often I'd been expected to adapt, so others wouldn't have to. This was the first time I'd let the adjustment land where it belonged. A few days later, the mortgage officer called again, this time to confirm everything was stable. No outstanding risks, no loose ends. She thanked me for my cooperation as if I'd done something extraordinary. In reality, I'd just stopped absorbing someone else's decisions. That night, I walked through the house slowly, room by room. It felt quieter, but also clearer. Not lonely, just honest. I understood then that reclaiming the house had also reclaimed something else. My right to pause, my right to say no, my right to exist in my family without being the default solution. The day my brother moved out, there was no confrontation, no final argument, just a tense exchange of keys and a brief nod. He looked tired, stripped of the certainty he'd worn so confidently months earlier. I didn't feel triumph, I felt resolution. After he left, my father lingered. He walked through the house slowly, touching the door frames, the kitchen counter, the window by the stairs. He told me he remembered when we first moved in, how proud he'd felt knowing one of his children had made it possible. I asked him why that pride hadn't protected me. He didn't deflect this time. He said he'd confused strength with endless capacity. He admitted he'd leaned on me because he believed I could handle it. I told him I could handle many things, but I shouldn't have had to handle being dismissed. That distinction mattered. We sat in silence after that, not awkward, just reflective. When he finally left, he thanked me for letting him stay as long as he had. It wasn't an apology, but it was closer than I'd ever heard. That evening, I changed the locks. Not out of fear, but clarity. The house was mine, fully and finally. For the first time, that truth felt settled not just legally, but emotionally. With the house quiet again, I turned my attention inward. The chaos had been loud enough to distract me from how deeply it had affected me. Now, without constant calls or documents to review, the emotional weight surfaced. I realized how often I'd minimized my own discomfort to keep peace. How easily I'd accepted imbalance as normal. The house situation had forced everything into the open, but the pattern had existed long before it. I scheduled a follow-up meeting with the attorney, not because I needed to, but because I wanted confirmation that nothing could be reversed without my consent again. She assured me the structure was solid. No one could move anything without my signature. That reassurance felt grounding. My father began inviting me to family dinners again, cautiously, like he wasn't sure where the boundaries now stood. I attended a few, stayed for limited time, left when I felt ready. No explanations. My brother didn't attend. I didn't push. Repairing pride wasn't my responsibility. One night I sat on the front steps, looking at the streetlights, thinking about how close I'd come to losing more than a house. I could have lost my voice entirely if the bank hadn't intervened. That thought stayed with me. Sometimes justice arrives quietly, disguised as paperwork and phone calls. Months passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. The tension didn't disappear completely, but it softened into something manageable. My father spoke to me differently now. He asked before assuming. He paused before deciding. It was subtle, but real. One afternoon, he admitted something I hadn't expected. He said the bank calling me first had scared him. Not because of the house, but because it revealed how much control he'd falsely believed he had. Hearing that explained more than any apology could. He asked if I resented him. I told him resentment came from silence, and silence was no longer my habit. That honesty seemed to relieve him. I ran into my brother unexpectedly at a grocery store weeks later. The interaction was stiff but civil. He told me the apartment was smaller than he expected. I said adjustments usually were. We shared a brief, uneasy laugh. It wasn't reconciliation, but it wasn't hostility either. That night, I thought about how power shifts don't always come with explosions. Sometimes they arrive through boundaries enforced calmly and consistently. The house no longer felt like a symbol of conflict. It felt like a marker in my life, a clear line between who I had been and who I was becoming. I wasn't waiting for validation anymore. I had proof, and that was enough. The final confirmation arrived in the mail on a quiet morning. Updated records, clean statements, my name alone, clearly printed, no footnotes, no shared responsibility. I placed the documents in a folder and set it in a drawer, knowing I wouldn't need to revisit them again. I walked through the house afterward, noticing small things I'd overlooked before. The way light hit the walls in the afternoon. The creak of the stairs, familiar, steady, unchanged. The house hadn't betrayed me. People had. That distinction mattered. My father called later that day, not about the house, but to ask how I was doing. I told him the truth. I said I felt lighter. He didn't respond right away, then said he was glad. I believed him. Looking back, I understood the turning point wasn't the title correction or the bank meeting. It was the moment I stopped explaining myself. When I let facts speak instead of emotion. When I allowed consequences to exist without rescuing anyone from them. The house was never just a house, it was evidence. Evidence that I could stand firm without becoming cruel. That I could protect myself without destroying my family. As I closed the door that night, I knew the story wasn't about loss anymore. It was about ownership, in every sense of the word. With the legal matters settled, the emotional consequences became harder to ignore. My father invited me over one afternoon, just the two of us. No agenda, no documents, no pressure. We sat in the living room, a space that suddenly felt neutral instead of charged. He told me he'd spent a lot of time thinking about how things unfolded. He admitted he'd assumed my reliability was limitless, that my silence meant consent. Hearing him name it felt important, even if it came late. I told him silence had never meant agreement, it meant survival. He asked if I trusted him anymore. I didn't answer immediately. Trust, I explained, wasn't something that reset automatically. It rebuilt slowly through consistency, not words. He nodded, accepting that boundary without pushing back. When I left, I noticed how different the interaction felt. No manipulation, no guilt, just two adults recalibrating. Driving home, I realized how rare it was for me to leave a family interaction without emotional residue. No anger, no regret, just clarity. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, the same place where everything had unraveled months earlier. This time, there were no papers waiting for me, no decisions being made without my input. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It felt settled, like something finally aligned. My brother reached out unexpectedly a few weeks later, not to argue, not to demand, just to talk. We met briefly, cautiously, both aware of the distance that still existed between us. He admitted he'd relied too heavily on Dad's promises and my silence. He said he'd never considered what it cost me. I didn't interrupt, I let him finish. When he asked if things could ever go back to how they were, I told him honestly that I didn't want them to. I said I didn't want resentment disguised as harmony. I wanted relationships where expectations were spoken, not assumed. He seemed uncomfortable with that idea, but he didn't dismiss it. We didn't reconcile fully. That wasn't the point. We acknowledged what happened without rewriting it. Afterward, I returned home and spent the evening doing something simple: cleaning, organizing, making the space my own again. I rearranged furniture, removed reminders of months spent under tension. As I worked, I realized how different my sense of ownership felt now. Not defensive, not anxious, just present. The house no longer represented conflict or proof. It was simply mine, and that simplicity felt like freedom. Time continued to do its quiet work. Family gatherings became more measured. My father respected my boundaries. My brother kept his distance but stayed civil. No one pretended things hadn't happened, but no one tried to reopen the wound either. I noticed changes in myself too. I spoke up sooner. I paused before agreeing. I stopped anticipating everyone else's needs at my expense. These shifts were subtle but powerful. One evening, my father told me he admired how I'd handled everything. I accepted the comment without deflecting it. That alone felt like progress. The house became a place of rest rather than vigilance. I hosted friends, filled the rooms with laughter, allowed myself to enjoy what I'd built instead of guarding it. Looking back, I saw how easily this could have gone differently. If I'd rushed to smooth things over, if I'd prioritized peace over truth, if I'd kept paying quietly and absorbing the loss. But I hadn't. And because of that, everything changed. I understood then that justice didn't have to be loud to be complete. It just had to be firm. The story no longer felt unfinished. It felt integrated, like a lesson that had settled deep enough to guide my future choices without bitterness. One afternoon, I received a routine call from the bank, a standard check-in. The mortgage officer confirmed everything was in perfect standing. Before hanging up, she thanked me again for my professionalism throughout the process. After the call, I thought about how strange it was that a stranger's adherence to protocol had done what years of family dynamics hadn't. It had forced honesty. It had required accountability. I walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the door frames, grounding myself in the present. This place had seen tension, silence, conflict, and growth. It had held everything without judgment. My father later sent a message inviting me to dinner. No pressure. No expectation. I agreed on my terms. As I prepared to leave, I realized something important. I wasn't going back into the family dynamic as the same person. I wasn't seeking approval or bracing for dismissal. I was choosing connection consciously, not out of obligation. That difference changed everything. The house stood behind me as I locked the door, steady and unchanged. It didn't need to prove anything anymore. Neither did I. Now, when I think back to the moment my father took the house out of my name, it no longer feels like betrayal alone. It feels like the catalyst that forced everything into the open. The mortgage officer calling me first wasn't luck. It was alignment. It was the moment facts interrupted assumptions and gave me space to stand. I didn't win by taking something from someone else. I won by refusing to disappear quietly. The house is still here. The mortgage is still paid. The family still exists, imperfect but more honest than before. And I exist within it differently now. I no longer measure my worth by how much I can carry for others. I measure it by how clearly I can advocate for myself. That shift didn't make me colder. It made me steadier. This story isn't about property or paperwork. It's about what happens when you stop surrendering your voice for the sake of peace. The quiet that fills the house now isn't emptiness. It's earned calm. And every time I turn the key in the door, I'm reminded that ownership isn't just about names on a document. It's about knowing when something is yours and refusing to let anyone take it without your consent.